Here is something that nobody in the mainstream sports media has really stopped to sit with. One of the most powerful apparel companies that has ever existed, a brand that has dressed championship rosters, outfitted Super Bowl runs, and managed the commercial machinery behind some of the biggest names in the history of professional sports, got caught completely off guard by a quarterback who hasn't started a regular season game in 2026 yet. Not by a Super Bowl MVP, not by a generational wide receiver dropping 60 touchdowns, by a 23-year-old who went in the 5th round, wore a number that wasn't his, and played behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league on a team that won 5 games. Nike is scrambling right now. External manufacturing partners, overloaded production lines, websites crashing under demand volume they weren't built to handle. The season hasn't even begun. If that doesn't tell you something fundamental about who Shedeur Sanders actually is, not as a prospect or a draft position, but as a force in American sports culture, then I don't know what story would. Let me take you back to something that happened in Avon, Ohio. Not an NFL stadium, a high school football game. Friday night under the lights, local crowd, the kind of setting that has nothing to do with professional football. Someone sitting in those stands looked around and counted 8 separate people, none of them connected to each other, all wearing Shedeur Sanders jerseys. 8 people at a high school game in Northeast Ohio, who independently decided that this player's name and number was the statement they wanted to make. No promotional event, no organized fan group, just 8 individuals making the same private choice. I think about that Avon moment a lot when I try to explain what the jersey demand data is really measuring, because what those 8 people were expressing isn't something Nike's spreadsheets capture. It's something older and more stubborn than brand management. It's genuine belonging. And when you see that kind of attachment at a high school game in a mid-size Ohio suburb, you are looking at the foundation of something that no forecasting model built around draft position can measure. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what the number 2 actually means in the context of Shedeur Sanders' life. This is not a detail, and I want to make sure I'm being clear about that. Most players have jersey numbers the way most people have zip codes, assigned by circumstance, functional, not particularly meaningful. The number 2 is not that for Shedeur. He built a personal apparel brand around it, too legendary, while he was still in high school at Trinity Christian in Texas, before an NFL career was anything more than a future aspiration he was working toward. He constructed a genuine commercial identity around that number with real creative intention and real long-term thinking. And when Colorado retired the number 2 in his honor, before he had taken a professional snap anywhere, that wasn't a program doing a nice gesture for a departing player. That was a university formally acknowledging that the number had become inseparable from the person in a way that programs almost never choose to recognize. Colorado was saying, this number on this program belongs to one person, and that relationship doesn't end when he moves on. The number 2, by the time Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, was not a digit. It was the accumulated symbolic weight of years of deliberate identity construction. So when the Browns confirmed that DeAndre Carter was already wearing 2, the league and everyone watching got another look at exactly who Shedeur Sanders is under pressure. Because the easy play, and there would have been genuine public appetite for it, was to make noise, to let the story become about the number, to build a narrative around being denied something that was rightfully his, and let that narrative generate sympathy and social media momentum. He didn't do any of that. He took number 12, a number with no particular resonance for him, no personal history, no cultural weight, and he went to work, quietly. And what the market did with that number 12 jersey is the part of this entire story that should have detonated every assumption Nike's commercial team had built around him. A 5th-round pick, wearing a number he didn't choose, on a team that won 5 games, became the top-selling jersey in his entire 2026 NFL draft class. He outsold every quarterback taken before pick 144. He outsold skilled position players who went in the first 2 rounds. He did it clearly and decisively, not in some ambiguous statistical margin that could be explained away. In the history of the NFL draft, a 5th-round selection had never led his class in jersey sales. That fact is not a footnote. It is the central commercial story of the 2025 NFL season. And I would argue that it got dramatically less attention than it deserved, precisely because the people covering the league had already committed to a narrative about Shedeur that the jersey numbers directly contradicted. It's uncomfortable to reconcile 5th-round bust risk with most commercially powerful player in his draft class, so a lot of people chose not to try. I want to slow down on what those number 12 sales actually meant, because this is where the real analytical insight lives. Buying a professional athlete's jersey is not an impulsive act. It's a $40 or $50 financial commitment, and a social commitment on top of that. You're telling everyone who sees you what you believe in, whose story you've bought into. A fan base purchasing jerseys at that volume for a 5th 30th-round pick isn't responding to on-field production, because at that point, there wasn't enough to drive commercial behavior at that scale. They were responding to a story, specifically the story of a player the league's evaluation process tried to minimize, who absorbed that treatment with visible composure and showed up in Cleveland and competed. The number 12 jersey sales were a measurement of narrative attachment. And narrative attachment, when it's the genuine organic kind rather than the manufactured marketing kind, is more durable and more powerful than anything advertising spend can build. Nike's models, it turns out, are built for the manufactured kind. First-round quarterbacks get projected commercial interest because the draft position signals the attention signals the audience size, and the infrastructure scales accordingly. The models are good at that. What they are not good at is organic cultural resonance that builds over years through performance, identity, and story. The kind that doesn't announce itself through draft capital or any of the conventional signals the commercial apparatus uses as inputs. Shedeur's commercial power didn't come from the league validating him. It came from a fan base that watched the league's evaluation process and formed its own independent conclusion, and then expressed that conclusion through consumer behavior at a scale the models weren't designed to capture. The market made its assessment of Shedeur Sanders completely independently of the NFL draft, and when those two assessments pointed in dramatically different directions, the market turned out to be the more accurate one. Now fast forward to March 30th, 2026. DeAndre Carter is gone. The number 2 spot is open. The Browns confirm publicly and immediately that Shedeur is reclaiming it. And Shedeur's response to that confirmation, which I think says everything about his understanding of his own commercial power, was a single post on X. Just the number, not an announcement, not a promotional message, not a statement about what the moment meant to him. 2. That's it. And what happened next was not the measured, gradual merchandise demand that Nike's planning systems are designed to manage. It was an instantaneous consumer surge of a kind that retail infrastructure simply isn't architected for. Fans who had been waiting, some of them for over a year, from the moment the number 12 was assigned, didn't browse or comparison shop or deliberate. They went directly to purchase. People who had already bought the 12 jersey started calling about exchange policies within hours of the announcement. The online platforms that handle Browns merchandise experienced traffic volume that exceeded what their systems were built to process. The queue to buy the jersey became a phenomenon in its own right, something people were posting about and documenting, because the wait itself became evidence of the scale of demand. And Nike, one of the most sophisticated supply chain operations in consumer retail, found itself behind, significantly, visibly, embarrassingly behind, production lines running over capacity. And then came the decision that tells you more about the severity of the miscalculation than any sales figure could. External manufacturing partners, contracted outside the original plan, brought in specifically to fill the gap between what Nike projected and what Shedeur's return to the number 2 actually produced. People here, Nike is using outside manufacturers and process it as routine operational news. It is not routine. For a brand operating at Nike's scale, making that call represents an acknowledgement that the internal architecture has been overcome. It is not a capacity adjustment. It is a company with enormous internal resources admitting that its own systems cannot handle what is being asked of them and going outside for help. That is the corporate equivalent of a coach calling for reinforcements in the middle of a game that was supposed to be under control, and it's happening before the first snap of the 2026 regular season. Let me put the complete picture of what Shedeur accomplished in his first professional season in front of you, because the cumulative weight of it gets obscured when you examine any single piece in isolation. He was the 144th pick. He had no meaningful preseason preparation, no first-team reps before being thrown into live game situations, no structural support from a roster built to compete. He wore a number that wasn't his, and still led his class in jersey sales. He made the Pro Bowl, the first Cleveland Browns quarterback to do that in nearly 20 years. He threw 10 interceptions that gave critics exactly the ammunition they needed to sustain the dismissive framing. And an independent scout, working without any organizational affiliation, broke down his tape and concluded that his production, relative to the circumstances he was operating in, compared favorably to quarterbacks given every conceivable advantage from day one. The combination of those outcomes, the commercial performance, the individual honor, the raw tape evaluation, assembled within circumstances that were objectively designed to limit his opportunity, is without precedent for a player taken where he was taken. And that was the number 12 version of this story. That was the version before the return to the number he actually built his identity around. Think carefully about what you're looking at when you account for all of that. The commercial foundation was already there, already proven, already operating at a scale that should have recalibrated every projection Nike had built. The number 12 demand was the proof of concept, the data point that should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of what Shedeur Sanders actually represents commercially. Nike either didn't read that signal clearly enough or decided their existing models were sufficient to handle whatever came next. The number 2 announcement demonstrated that neither interpretation was adequate. There's something about the emotional weight of the number 2 coming back that I don't think commercial analysis alone can capture, and I want to try to articulate it. The wait for the number 2 wasn't just a practical jersey situation. It was another episode in a narrative that Shedeur's audience had been living through with him since draft night 2025. The unexplained slide, the rounds passing, the 5th round selection, while the commercial marketplace was simultaneously signaling something completely different. Then the number situation, arriving in Cleveland and having to take a different number, another thing that should have been his being held somewhere he couldn't immediately reach. Then the season itself, the wins, the losses, the interceptions, the Pro Bowl, the tape that told a more complicated story than the record suggested. And then March 30th, when something that had been waiting returned to where it belonged. The fans who bought those number 12 jerseys and went back to their phones to find the number 2 finally available. They weren't just making a merchandise decision, they were finishing a chapter. The pent-up energy that hit the purchase queue in the hours after that X post wasn't just consumer demand, it was an entire fan base exhaling at once. Nike built a dam without any real understanding of how much water was sitting behind it. That's the most honest way I know to describe what happened. The modeling assumptions were built on draft position, on conventional metrics of commercial potential, on the historical patterns of what 5th-round quarterbacks have produced in jersey markets. None of those inputs accounted for the fact that Shedeur Sanders had been building a relationship with his audience for years before the NFL was involved, that the relationship deepened rather than diminished through the challenges of his first professional season, and that the return of the number 2 was the kind of moment that concentrated years of accumulated emotional investment into a single commercial decision point. You cannot model that with conventional tools. And the evidence that Nike tried to and got it badly wrong is sitting in the form of external manufacturing contracts and overloaded production infrastructure in the middle of spring, months before a regular season game has been played. Here is what I keep coming back to. What happens when the football actually starts? What happens when Shedeur Sanders runs out of the tunnel for the first regular season snap of 2026 in that number 2 jersey, as the confirmed starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, in front of a fan base that has been building emotional investment since draft night? The commercial infrastructure around him is already strained under preseason conditions. The story already has the full shape of something that hundreds of thousands of people have bought into before the on-field performance has had the opportunity to justify it in the conventional sense. When the performance follows, and everything the evidence points toward, from the coaching staff's reported commitment to his development to the independent tape evaluation to the voluntary workouts documented this offseason, suggests it will get the genuine opportunity to do so. The commercial curve Nike is currently scrambling to stay ahead of is going to move in directions their projections almost certainly don't capture. The number 12 jersey was the early warning system. It was the market speaking clearly and specifically about what this player means commercially, doing so before the on-field performance infrastructure was in place to justify it at a traditional analytical level. Everything that followed, the Pro Bowl, the independent tape evaluation, the coaching commitment, the return of the number 2, the instant consumer surge, the external manufacturing contracts, has been the market's original judgment getting confirmed in successive waves. Nike missed the first wave. They got overwhelmed by the second. The season hasn't started. If the on-field trajectory that every available indicator points toward materializes, what comes next is not something their current supply chain posture is equipped to absorb. The fans in Avon, Ohio tried to tell them. The number 12 sales tried to tell them. The Pro Bowl tried to tell them. The X post with just the number 2 told them in terms that crashed websites and triggered emergency contracts. The number is back on a Browns jersey. The football hasn't started yet, and right now, somewhere in Nike's planning operation, there are people with spreadsheets trying to model what comes next. And I genuinely don't think their models are ready for the answer.